Thank you for joining us today. I'm James Maguire. I'm a family lawyer, and with me today is Cecilia Goodwin, who's a specialist criminal lawyer. We're going to roll out a series of videos about coercive control, and this one's going to touch on the prevalence of coercive control in family and criminal cases. At Maguire Family Law, we undertook a survey in the summer, August 2024, sample of 2,000 people looking at coercive control in their lives. One of the statistics that came out is that 1 in 5 people feel that they are or have been in a coercive and controlling relationship. So, Cecilia, do you see that as a surprising fact or no surprise?
No, I'm actually not surprised by the figures. I think we're definitely seeing a new trend in more people becoming more aware of their behaviors and how their behaviors might, for example, affect another person. But I think we're also seeing an increase in people that may not actually realize that something or certain behaviors are coercive or controlling. So I'm not surprised at all. And I think there is a lot to do in this field in terms of the legislation, making people understand what the legislation is, but also people being able to feel comfortable and confident in that they're not doing anything that could fall foul of this legislation.
Yeah. And I suppose one of the issues is understanding what coercive control is. And certainly from my family work, it seems to me that it's a pattern of behaviours. It's not always about violence. So this sort of domestic abuse can be emotional abuse, can be gaslighting. Commonly I come across sort of economic abuse where people are financially controlling. So again, it's not always the violence, but it can be the emotional impact that it has on a party, a victim.
Absolutely. And I think in relation to the legislation, it's the easiest way to think about it is in this way, in that it's broken into 2 parts. So the first part is where there is, as you said, a pattern of behavior. So where somebody, for example, is made to feel threatened of violence, but it's got to happen on more than 2 occasions. So that's, just breaking it down in the simplest form. Then you have the other part, which is a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more difficult sometimes to spot. And that is where you have behaviors that continue. So it's got to be continuous, or, should be some sort of repetition to it, where somebody is being controlled,
Mhm.
somebody is, living in a way that they ordinarily wouldn't, because somebody is controlling how they live, what they wear, who their friends are, who they associate with. And then obviously the biggest thing in terms of the amazing research that obviously Maguire's conducted in relation to stats on this topic is what really are the biggest sort of red flags, you might say. And we've obviously, through your research, as you said, you found that a lot of it was to do with financial control. But then we also have another area where it could be things that are learned behavior. So, for example, from a cultural perspective, it might be that your culture or your religious background or the society you come from, for example, it is natural that a household, for example, because of course you have to have a relationship between the two, sort of a personal relationship. It could be family, it could be a spouse. But let's say you have, for example, a spousal relationship, husband and wife. From a culture, and I'll say for me, for my culture, it is not unusual for there to be defined roles, for example, in a household. So it might be that the husband is the one that goes out and works, gets the money in, and therefore ordinarily would probably have control of the household income. Um, the wife might be the homemaker, might be the person that cooks, stays at home, and so forth. I am finding more and more now, in terms of since the introduction of this legislation, that those cultural norms can and sometimes have ended up coming on the wrong side of this
Right,
legislation.
that's interesting.
And it's situations where, for example, somebody says, actually, I don't like the fact that I have to do all the cooking, I have to do all the cleaning, I don't like the fact that I have to ask you for money to go shopping or whatever. But ordinarily, it might have been a normal occurrence. So it's trying to understand the different behaviors and patterns and behavior that could end up getting somebody, being investigated for something like this. And it's something that I think lawyers, academics, and people who are finding themselves in these situations are still grappling with, because it's legislation that is evolving.
Okay, that's interesting, because a question I'm sometimes asked is, are we seeing an increase? And through the family courts, whether children cases, divorce cases, and going back to this fundamental statistic of 1 in 5 people feeling that they are or have been in a coercive, controlling relationship. I have been in practice for nearly 30 years, and sadly, there's always been an element of violence, and from whether from the family courts, the criminal courts, that sometimes it was trivialized as in it's a domestic, and stereotypically it was always seen as violence. Society has moved on, and I'd certainly say in 2024, in the last sort of 12, 24 months, or post the pandemic, that more and more, in the cases that I'm seeing, is the use of social media or technology to control people. So we're talking here about spyware,
Yeah.
videoing, tracking, monitoring people on social media and the movements. And I suspect I see, like you do, probably the sharp end of
Yeah.
some people's lives, and so we'll often see it post separation,
Yeah.
during the divorce process. But I imagine that's the tip of the iceberg, that this is probably going on during the relationship as well. And the other aspect that sticks out to me in that sort of that coercive, controlling behaviour is the financial abuse. That again, how society's moved on,
Yeah.
and perhaps for the greater good, that people have their careers,
Yeah.
men and women, and can be financially independent. But something I see when we're doing financial disclosure,
Yeah.
and it still surprised me that people do keep their finances quite separate.
Yeah.
But it can be so stark that you'll have one party, let's say the stereotypical husband, who's in control of all of the money,
Yeah.
and then to the detriment of the other party, and it kind of keeps them in that relationship for
Yeah.
a fear of moving on.
Yeah.
And I've certainly seen some of my clients that have been subsequently prosecuted for sort of that financial, economic abuse. I don't know what you see.
Yeah. So I think it's very varied in my world, in terms of criminal justice system, because as we touched on, there are so many different types of behaviors that can result in something being coercive and controlling. And so I think certainly in my area, I tend to see more cases coming through when there is a breakup in a relationship. It doesn't ever occur where, for example, in terms of my experience, where somebody just wakes up and thinks, oh, hang on, this is coercive and controlling, and I'm going to go to the police about it, for example. It's usually there's been some sort of argument or a build-up in, the breakup, of a marriage or relationship. But mostly I've seen an increase when there are family law proceedings attached. So it's whether there is an issue about children, about custody, and one party at that stage then says, oh, actually, I've been controlled, I've been coerced for 5-6 years, and, I'm now, you know, um, disclosing it. Or whether there's a divorce. And again, it's to do with finances, whether perhaps somebody is trying to get a little bit more money out of it. Obviously, it's not my area of specialism in terms of family and how that works, but I have seen definitely that whenever I come across these sorts of cases with coercive control, usually 9 times out of 10, breakup in a relationship, and definitely family proceedings attached. So I don't know. My question to you then would be, would you say then that sometimes you have clients that you're representing in which they are falsely accused of controlling coercive behaviour for the benefit of the proceedings that you're dealing with?
It's an interesting and difficult question, that because I suppose at the end of the day, you never know for sure.
Yeah.
I see patterns in the type of work, and certainly that there can be a pattern whereby at the time the relationship breaks down, that coincides within a couple of weeks of a report being made to the police. And if the police do get involved, then um, the alleged offender, if you like, he or she's bailed
Yes.
to stay away from the family home.
Yeah.
So it's quite a sort of direct route to get someone out of the house.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then with the expectation, they're usually the financially stronger party, the expectation that all the outgoings, the mortgage, the bills will be paid. And that police involvement can take many months, several months.
Absolutely.
So, but of course, there may have been a reason for that.
Yeah.
And it may be that that person has, reached breaking point, and
Yeah.
whether through support of whether charities, Women's Aid, family and friends, has found the strength
Yes,
to report it.
report,
So,
absolutely.
it is always difficult, but it kind of leads on to probably another issue about whether, because there's a lot of awareness nowadays, and we'll probably talk about that in another video, but
Yeah.
in terms of the potential for coercive control, that those words to be trivialized. And we haven't mentioned sort of narcissism, but I get a lot of inquiries from people saying, do we have experience in dealing with cases where the other party is a narcissist, which is a different type of behavior. So I'd just be interested in your view in terms of, do you think that these words, because there's a lot of awareness nowadays, there's a risk that it could be trivialized?
Yeah, no, I do, because so for example, when I'm representing somebody who is has been arrested in respect of a matter of coercive control, there are always two sides to every story. And it all goes back for me to trying to understand the individual in front of you. Because things that they may do may, in their mind, might not result in their minds to anything close to wanting to control the other person. But it's just how they are. And that's where we get the other sort of issues where you have to look at the background of the person. So narcissism, or sometimes, being on the spectrum, autistic, and there's sort of nuances that you might not pick up that somebody else might. So I think it's quite important to obviously take into account the whole and wider picture in order for you to be able to understand whether there has been an issue of coercive control. But at the same time, you do get some people who use this as a weapon in order to get to whatever it is they're trying to accomplish, whether it's the children, whether it's this, or whether it's just getting back at the person. Maybe there have been, as you said, instances where certain behaviors have been going on for so long, and maybe they've got to their breaking point. But whether or not they are coercive and controlling behaviors, or whether they're just, this person is just a bit controlling, that's just their nature. We don't know, and it's something that we have to grapple with.
I think we come across people, in every relationship, it might be that one of the parties has high expectations,
Absolutely.
high standards, and the other person doesn't. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're coercive and controlling.
Yeah.
And I think what we're looking at, certainly from a family perspective, is just that sort of pattern of those behaviours and the impact that it could actually have
Yes.
on someone's sort of emotional well-being and their health. Because the risk is that in family cases generally, if everyone starts saying that the other party, and there'd be cross allegations of someone's either a narcissist or coercive controlling, it can impact the other support agencies, whether it's sort of via the charities or the police involvement, because then they're forced to potentially investigate all sorts of different allegations.
And that's something that does happen. I've seen it where, for example, a client has been accused of coercive control, but then in, sort of the process of me preparing their case, it turns out that maybe they were actually the victim of coercive control by the other party, by the party that's reported, by the party that is the main complainant. And then you end up with a situation where police are having to investigate both sides to see where the truth lies. And yeah, I think in terms of where this goes, it is going to be something where I think people have to really think and think carefully about what is coercive control. Are my circumstances actually coercive control? Because again, the supporting charities and other parties, it is going to get to a point where they just can't handle the influx that may result in respect to what we're seeing now.
Okay. In further videos that we'll do, we'll touch on how the courts are dealing with this and what type of behaviours actually come before the criminal and family courts. But for now, I'd like to just thank you very much for this part of the video. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.